the culmination of your educational experience is a slip of paper that has the name of a job on it. You go through this whole K to 12, then 4 years of undergraduate, and finally what you get is, okay, this is so you can be a nurse. And so there is a tendency for us to think this whole thing is about preparing you to perform certain vocational skills. And that's certainly the way the world wants you to think about education. Right. But I think it's important that we identify, actually it's enculturation.
To prevail in any war, one must fight strategically, identifying and exploiting decisive points that promise great advantage. Yet, for far too long, the Church of Jesus Christ has grown accustomed to a back foot theology, perpetually defensive, perpetually reactive. It has settled into the posture of a beleaguered victim, content to weather the corruption around it, rather than advance against the rot. In the aftermath of battle, we often find ourselves ill-prepared to take ground, opting instead for the construction of fragile, bubble-wrapped silos that fail to challenge, let alone perplex the enemies of God. Meanwhile, under the banner of Christ's sovereignty, the Church squanders its mandate, while the enemies of Christ claim dominion over the earth and humanity itself. They labor to shape the thoughts, actions, and affections of God's image bearers, most effectively through the instrument of academia. Education is not a neutral ground. It is a battleground. It is the soil upon which the fiercest battles for the hearts and minds of humanity are waged. It is the front line of culture making, with consequences that ripple through generations. When Christians retreat from this terrain or naively surrender it, they imperil their own posterity. They do so often under the delusion of neutrality, a lie that posits education is merely the collection of impartial facts, devoid of moral or spiritual bias. This friction imagines that knowledge is inherently harmless, as though all truth is benign, or as if the forbidden tree in Eden were nothing more than myth. Yet the wrong kind of knowledge does more than mislead. It corrodes a man's ability to exercise dominion rightly, to be fruitful, and to multiply as God intended. Such knowledge might cloak a man in worldly affluence and respectability, but it starves him of his created purpose, leaving him incapable of freedom and flourishing as God designed. It's a privilege to host Dr. Ben Merkle, a man who stands at the crossroads of academic excellence and faithful leadership. As president of New St. Andrew's College, he equips the next generation of scholars and leaders with wisdom and purpose. With advanced degrees from Oxford University in Oriental and Jewish Studies, and along with a background in English literature and education, Dr. Merkle pairs academic rigor with spiritual clarity. He also serves as a teaching elder at Christ Church in Moscow, demonstrating that true education is discipleship, training men and women to transform the world under God's authority. Ben Merkle, welcome to Of Flames and Crowns.
Thank you. Very
glad you could join me. Glad you could join me for this one, Ben. Yeah. We're going to be talking about some really important things, and I want to begin with what should be considered a crisis. Studies show that almost 2/3 of children who grow up in Christian households essentially abandon their faith when they get to college. Mm-hmm. To what degree do you think this phenomenon is influenced by the type of education these young people would have received?
Do you mean at the college?
At the college that they go to?
Well, yeah, I think actually one of the things you have to do is you have to backtrack a little bit, because I think that if we were to dive in a little more cynically into that data, I think one of the things you would find is these were kids who actually had been lost in the years leading up to graduation from high school. It's just that it wasn't clear to their parents yet that this was the case, because they still came to church with mom and dad. They still, they went through the motions, but they had been lost a few years before. Right. And college just afforded the freedom for them to then reveal what they had actually already become.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a crisis in college, but so much of the crisis actually can be traced back to K-12. But probably for our focus, we should be looking more at what's going on in college. Yes, I think that there is something that is going on in the curriculum, but I think that's honestly, that's a piece of it. But it plays together with the larger enculturation that is going on in these college campuses that brings in the dorms, the residence life, the campus lifestyle, the party, everything.
Yes.
Because I think, in my experience, what I noticed when students were falling away from the faith, generally, it started with a compromise of moral standards, whether it was alcohol, like when I was a student, it would have been the sort of party scene, which was primarily alcohol, but now it might be drugs, whatever. And then generally some sort of sexual compromise. And then once that's happened, that's when your philosophy prof what your philosophy prof is spewing starts to become really attractive because you were raised with a standard and you've compromised it, and now there's this guilt upon you, and you go to the class, and that's when actually these worldviews that say, no, these are constructs, this is something from your parents that you need to walk away from. That's when that suddenly starts to sound much more appealing and interesting.
It comes across as an excuse for living this life of sinfulness, right?
And that's to say that that's the way it's always playing out is obviously an oversimplification, but I think that that's a common thread in it. But it's the larger enculturation of what's going on in these colleges rather than just one particular class most of the time.
Yeah, that's good. But this hasn't always been the case, Ben. Generally speaking, this idea of this many Christian young people who grew up Christian and are now falling away wasn't always the case. What happened? How did we get to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we, first of all, we lost the expectation that our children ought to follow in our footsteps with regard to the faith. We've come to this notion that a profession of faith is not real or authentic or to be trusted unless it comes from a position of having first walked away and disbelieved. And so I can remember as a young Christian student, basically knowing that my testimony was not going to be believed or have credibility until I'd actually gone and gotten into big sin. Every testimony that I heard was the testimony of somebody who'd been in deep sin and rebellion and then converted. And so I love the story of the power of the gospel in shaping your life. But I was like constantly as a high school kid, it's like, okay, if I'm actually going to be a faithful Christian, first I need to go to prison.
Exactly.
Or I need to get in some real sin.
I need to have some real crisis.
Yeah.
That conversion has to look radical.
It does. It does. And we tend to not believe the faith of our children unless, or the next generation, unless we see them go through some, furnace of testing and actually like walking away. And so I think that we kind of, let me pair that with something else, which is in the midst of all of that, we've let go of the education of our children. And when I say education, I think one of the things that's really important for us to understand is when I say education, what I mean is the enculturation of them, not simply the ability to give them certain vocational skills, but the enculturation of these are your values. This is what is beautiful. This is what is true. This is what is noble. This is what is laying down your life for. That enculturation, because we have this cynicism of, well, if my children just say what I told them to say, then it's not real, then we're reluctant to actually pass on that enculturation to them. And it seems like almost a virtue to hand them over to a supposedly neutral educational institution and then hope that faith emerges on the other side, a faith that has been made it through the furnace of testing and doubt and all of that, because that we believe will be legitimate.
Exactly. It's almost like we're trying to engineer and manufacture this conflict that will then somehow prove faith.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the thing is, when you say it like that, the neglect of the education of our children, that you actually start to see why people, there's some logic to it. There's some logic to it. The problem is it's just not a logic that comes out of Scripture.
Yes.
Because in Scripture, we see really clearly the constant command to fathers, raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Or in Deuteronomy 6, the description of you're supposed to raise your children, speaking of things, tying it on their hand, around their head, and you're supposed to talk about it when you're standing up, when you're sitting down. They're supposed to be raised, immersed in it.
Yes.
And it's like that's God's way of raising our children. And I think that's actually pretty high-handed, rebellious of us to hear that and go,
I know better.
I don't think that's sincere. I think I've got a way around it that will actually be more effective.
Wow.
And we're seeing the fruit of choosing this kind of man-made idea of how our children ought to be raised as opposed to God's commands.
Yeah, that's very good. Then as we continue to kick this conversation off, I want to get into some definitions here. And I want to begin with a definition of education.
Yeah.
Now, a couple of years ago, I kind of sat down and wrote a sort of educational mission statement for my family and how my wife and I were going to raise our kids. And this is what I came up with, and I'd love to get some of your reactions to it. I said here, education is an avenue through which children are equipped to go forth as godly culture builders who will subdue and exercise dominion over the earth, and who will know a comprehensive freedom that enables them to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
What might you add to this definition? What would you clarify or emphasize in a statement like this? And I guess how would that bleed into your own definition of what education is?
Well, I like that a lot because, I mean, if you take the NSA mission statement, graduate leaders, shape culture, faithful living in the Lordship of Jesus Christ, it's actually quite similar to what you're describing. I can promise
you it wasn't plagiarized.
Oh, I see. What a coincidence.
We just happen to be very like-minded on this, so that's what it is.
So it's hard to argue with it if it models that so closely. I think the one thing that I already did it earlier when I was speaking, but I like to constantly mention enculturation.
Right.
I think that education is often it is kind of distilled down to just the imparting of vocational skills. We think of education as something that gets you a job. The culmination of your educational experience is a slip of paper that has the name of a job on it. You go through this whole K-12, then 4 years of undergraduate, and finally what you get is, okay, this is so you can be a nurse. And so there is a tendency for us to think this whole thing is about preparing you to perform certain vocational skills. And that's certainly the way the world wants you to think about education. But I think it's important that we identify, actually it's enculturation. I think it's interesting, even American secular education, as we've lost an education that values the heritage of the West, and an appreciation for America and the story of America, then all of a sudden we're graduating students that don't have any appreciation for the West or America. And it's like, that actually matters. Like if you're not instilling that kind of enculturation, you lose something significant. And it's and vocational skills flow out of that, but they're a real part of it. If you fail to enculturate the next generation to carry on the heritage of what they've been given, they will tear down what they're given, and your society falls apart. I mean, I think that's largely the last few years in America has been seeing our society fall apart because we've not successfully enculturated our children. And people will hear like vocational skills sounds pragmatic, enculturation sounds a little ethereal, wispy, whatever. But you notice if you don't have a generation that is enculturated in this heritage, you have the collapse of society itself. It's not that you can't get a job as a nurse, it's that nursing jobs don't exist, or because the whole society collapses. And so it's actually this more fundamental and more foundational kind of work that education has to perform.
Yes, exactly. I want to get some of your responses to common objections people have to this concept of Christian education. One of the common objections I've heard is the objection, well, I turned out just fine. I went to a public school. I was trained for vocation. I turned out just fine. I'm walking with the Lord. How would you respond to an assertion like that as people try to object to the necessity of a Christian education?
universal advice drawn from a pool of one is just kind of bad. You know, like, and the thing is, we do this all the time. And I think dads are particularly bad at this.
Yeah.
Like I see like, okay, so here's what I did, I did, military, I played football, I did, I got this degree and it worked out for me. So therefore, son, this is the path you must walk.
Right.
And you've got a pool of one, and you're drawing this universal advice for all of mankind.
Right.
God made the world so diverse, and it very rarely works out for other people just as it did for you. So that's a bad way of reasoning.
Yes.
The other thing, I think, particularly on this question, is it presupposes that the school system that you're advising students to go to now is the same school system you went to.
Right.
And it just flat isn't.
Right.
It is nowhere near the same. So I see this like I tell parents, listen, you've got a bunch of these colleges that are antithetical and hostile to the faith, and they're there to pull your children away from the faith.
Yeah.
You send them there, you need to expect certain results, and they will come back with exactly that observation. Like, I went through a secular university, and the thing is, I did too. I went to the University of Idaho from 91 to 96, and it was a secular school. And the thing is there was hostility to my faith, but the hostility to my faith was something that actually was really good for me. It was, I can remember the classes where I had to like stand up and stand up for my faith and be challenged in this way that was like, it was formative for me, and it made me into who I am now. I learned to lead, I learned to speak, I learned all of that in standing for the faith during that time. And so I understand people saying that you tell me that there's hostility to the faith on the campus, but I remember that hostility, and that's the thing I want for my children. I want them to experience that testing and everything.
Right.
I get that, but what I'm saying is the hostility to the faith now is not the hostility to the faith that I experienced back in 91 to 96. It's a whole new world. It's a whole different ballgame, and you're not signing them up for the same experience. You're signing them up for something entirely different.
That's good. Let's deal with another objection here.
Yeah.
The objection, what about being salt and light in secular schools? So where parents kind of use this as a reason to launch their kids into the public education system because they view their kids as missionaries who are there to infiltrate the system and evangelize their peers and whoever's there. How do you respond to that?
Your kids aren't missionaries. They just aren't. They really are not missionaries. And this is the thing, even at the college level, I'm at the K to 12 level. I just think that's just terrible advice. It really is terrible advice. Right. You're sending them somewhere where they're going to be completely pulled away from their faith, and everything is set up to do that. K to 12. Let's say your first 4 years of undergraduate in college. I'm willing to grant completely that there are some young men and women that ought to go into the lion's den to be tested at a much higher level.
Sure.
As I said earlier, I'm just always loath to give the universal advice unless I feel like really strongly about it.
Yes.
And I do about that K to 12. But at the college level, I don't think I can say no faithful Christian could ever go to a secular school. That's not the case. But I would say this: you need to understand how rare a person it is that is equipped for that. And the problem is your parents are the worst judges of that, because all parents believe their children are exceptional.
Yes.
And it's just sad how many times I'll sit there with parents, I'll say, yeah, but I've given them this education, they're ready. And I can just look at them and say, they're so not, and you're so deluded. And it's the love of a father and mother, so I get why they won't hear it, but they're wrong. It's highly exceptional when you have somebody who's ready for it. and this is so funny because we're at NSA now, so we get these applications, and a significant chunk of our incoming students are coming from the homeschooling world, and we get transcripts from the classical schools or Christian schools or whatever, and then we get transcripts from the homeschool. Those homeschool transcripts are largely put together by mom.
Right.
No homeschooling mother has ever given their son less than a B+ in a grade.
Right.
Because they're all so exceptional.
So good. Exactly.
Yeah. But they aren't. They simply are not. And I think 95% of the parents who are saying that are truly deluded. I went to Oxford for a master's and a doctorate. When I showed up at Oxford, I was already married.
Right.
I had 5 kids.
Right.
I'd already served as an elder at Christ Church and a professor at New St. Andrews, and had been a minister. That's what I brought with me. That's the credentials I brought with me when I stepped into Oxford, and because of that, it was a testing experience, and it was very good. But I had the gravitas and whatnot to hold me, to my faith. But I remember telling my wife after we'd been there for a little bit, if I had come here as an 18-year-old boy, I would not have made it.
Wow.
I really wouldn't have made it. And I mean, I can think highly of myself because of the places I've climbed, but I know that I was not one of those exceptional people.
So just to narrow in on that, because maybe people can't really wrap their minds around what that pressure is. What is it that you think you would have encountered as an 18-year-old that would have wiped you out?
Well, at Oxford, it would have been, it would have gone to my head. Oxford was unique in its, Oxford is unique in its wealth, prestige, privilege, all of these things. And when you walk up to your college, literally, I walk up to my college, there's a crowd of tourists hoping to peek in, and I, because I'm a member here, I walk right in because this is me, and that will go to your head so quick. And I watch so many people get so full of themselves, and that pride and that arrogance then goes to battle with their faith.
Right.
And then there are there are opportunities to get into sin that didn't exist or are far more powerful than when you were living at home with your parents. Right. As I said before, it's tawdry and mundane, but it is this very what you would expect. It's sexual sin, sexual temptation. It's slipping into alcohol, drugs, whatever. Or particularly with boys, it's the discovery that though you were able to do your chores when you were at home and mom and dad made you, when you get to school, you discover you're actually a lazy little slug, incapable of doing anything. And then you start skipping your classes and all of that. And then all the vices start creeping in because you have no virtue to push them out. Right. And you succumb.
Yeah. It sounds more like what you're alluding to here is more of a social pressure as opposed to an ideological pressure in the classrooms. Is there any threat from that?
Oh, yeah. I think that the ideological pressure is there and is profound. I just think that it tends to take advantage and come after certain other things are there. When I hear, you hear some young man starting to wrestle with, the reality of God, and my temptation is always like, okay, what's her name? Tell me, who have you gotten into trouble with? What's actually underneath this? Yes. Now that's a little too dismissive because many times it really simply is an intellectual. They weren't ready for it. I do think that what you discover is your Christian education, because it was aimed at a younger person's frame, was simpler. And then it encounters these difficult things, and you tend to say, "Oh, it was this simplistic thing that is so easily dismissed," without taking the time to actually. This is why I think being able to study scripture and theology at the college level is so helpful, is because you suddenly discover that this simplistic explanation you received here actually can be unpacked in this much more deep and profound level that you weren't ready for when you were an 8-year-old, but now you are, and now you have somebody who can take you and show you the depth and the richness, and you start to see, oh, this is real. This is these questions I had. There's answers to them, and this is profound, and this is deep, and this is rich. But what happens is if you just go with that simplistic understanding and you encounter real challenges, but you don't have anybody to walk you through and help you to understand these answers, it can overwhelm.
Yes. Oh, it certainly can. Let's deal with another common objection here, Ben. Another is the assertion that family worship and careful oversight are enough to offset the influence of non-Christian education. So I'm doing family worship every day. We go for about 20 minutes. I make sure to ask my kids questions after school each day. And because of that, I think we're fine.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's interesting parenting the way parenting itself goes through stages. Yeah. And I think that the early stage, I mean, I can remember this when our kids were really little. The early stage it's intense because it's like, this is when you don't get any sleep. You don't make it through a church service because you're constantly carrying somebody out, and these are people that just need so much attention. It's intense, and then when you get good at that, and you get good at bringing in things like family worship, and then you start to see this beauty emerges, and you start to feel the beauty of this is what a Christian home is. Like my kids see things through the lens of Scripture and all of that. Yeah. But the problem is they don't stay at that age. And what I see frequently happens is the kids grow up, but the family culture stays here, or dad doesn't know how to like grow the family with them. Right. And they still tend to think of this thing that was beautiful when they were 5 and 7 years old, but now they're 17 and 18, and he hasn't figured out, like he's still thinking as long as we've got this, we're good, but he's not seeing the kinds of challenges that they're actually wrestling through and the things that are out there. And I think that's where I've seen a lot of families who, by all appearances, had it nailed in these early years and then had everything fall apart up here. And this is a really, really common phenomenon. Yeah. And I think it's because dads didn't know how to grow up with their kids and understand. Like now, it's funny because like now me being a dad is mostly about me being a friend. It's really just being a friend. Stage, and a lot of it was I needed to be earning the right to that friendship during those years from here to where we are now. And I think if dads haven't been paying attention to that, they miss something big.
That's huge. Let's deal with one more objection here, Ben. And the objection is this: 1 + 1 = 2, whether in Christian math or non-Christian math. Right? Like, what's the difference? What's the difference between a Christian approach to math and a non-Christian approach to math? Right. What's the big deal with emphasizing this Christian education when it seems like it has the same outcomes?
Well, so first of all, yes, 1 + 1 = 2. If you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're an atheist, it does. Now, the reason that's true is because God is true. I believe the Muslim, the atheist, all have the blessing of natural revelation, the law of God written on their heart, and they don't need to worship God in order to avail themselves of that knowledge. And so I have no problem with granting a non-Christian education as being rigorous, true, something that I can benefit from. I've had many instructors that were non-Christians who, because of their grasp of natural revelation at a depth far deeper than mine, I can sit there and say, "You're the doctor, teach me," and I can receive that. But I do think that, first of all, I'd say I would go to that enculturation piece. I don't think that the result is the same because of the enculturation. I think that enculturation is far more important. And even the student who is in a secular university, that rare kid who's like got what it takes to stand, they need a home base to go back to that's filled with that enculturation. You know, when I was at Oxford, we lived in two different places, and both it was this sweet little stone, cottages out in the country outside of Oxford.
Beautiful.
And I would go to class, but I would come home to a wife and 5 kids in a little Christian oasis, and that restored me every time. Like I needed that. So I think we need to make sure that we understand the significance of the enculturation piece. The other is that 1 + 1 is 2, whether you're Christian or non-Christian. But it is interesting how the more you reject the Christian worldview, the more that in and of itself starts to get questioned.
Yes.
We have the question that has legitimately been considered in American schools over the last 10 years of whether math is racist.
Right.
And then suddenly you're starting to wonder, is 1 + 1 = 2?
Right.
Did I just oppress someone by saying that 1 + 1 is 2? And then I think you are in danger of losing those things when you reject that Christian foundation.
Yes.
It's one of the things that I know I picked it up from my father-in-law, Doug Wilson, but I believe it's referenced elsewhere. But I remember him just noting that individuals are always inconsistent. We're all inconsistent.
Yeah.
We will affirm one thing and then we'll do things that are not actually consistent with that. But cultures over time are consistent. And I think that an individual can deny God, deny all of that, and be a brilliant mathematician.
Yeah.
But a culture that denies him, eventually that catches up.
Yes.
There's something that catches up, and there's something that will defeat that culture and tear it all down.
Wow. That's very good. I want to move on here and discuss the myth of educational neutrality. And I want to begin with a quote from Os Guinness, who once wrote, and I quote, "Christian thinking is not merely thinking about Christian topics. It is the ability to think about anything and everything in a consistently Christian manner." So how does this statement challenge the prevalent myth of educational neutrality, which insists that facts and knowledge are devoid of moral or theological bias?
Right. Well, I think it's kind of backtracking to what I was just saying, that you describing facts. There are a whole host of worldview assumptions that go before that allow you to think that way. Yeah. Back up even further, the scientific revolution flows out of the Renaissance and flows alongside with the Protestant Reformation. There is a theological foundation to this way of thinking.
Yes.
And you take away that theological foundation, I think you lose that way of thinking.
That's very good. You've been using this term enculturation quite a bit throughout this entire conversation. There's 2 key terms that are often associated with Christian education. The word Padeia in Greek and the word mashal in Hebrew.
Okay.
Could you break down what these terms mean? So what is behind these concepts, and how do they feed into our understanding of enculturation and what that actually looks like as a pedagogical tool and device?
So it's interesting. Both of those terms have an element of not just passing down a culture, but cultural leadership.
Right.
So the Padeia was the Greek conception of what it meant to be a Greek citizen. To be educated in the Padeia was to understand Greekness itself, but not just to be a member of the Greek people, but to be a leader of the Greek people. It's when I say citizenship then actually was a very small minority, and these are the people that are actually the leaders of the culture. And so Padeia was the education that taught them the literature, the music, the history, all of those things of their people that made them love their people and made them want to fight and die for their people and made them want to fight for the political rights of their people. It was their identity as a nation. Mashal is, I love the mashal one. It's interesting because it's a Hebrew verb that refers to, it's one of these verbs that has 2 meanings. One is to rule as a king. So when you sit on a throne, you make decrees, you tell people what to do, you're mashaling, okay? But the other meaning for the verb mashal is to speak a proverb. So when you speak a proverb, when you make an observation about the world, the way it works, and the mystery of it all, that is also mashal. To understand the world the way it is to have the skill to be a ruler. Solomon is the epitome of that. You think of him and the two women fighting over the baby.
Yes.
And excuse me, he has the wisdom to say, chomp the baby in half, because right there he sees what's going on, and that seeing what's going on, and that knowing how to make the right decision, that's mashal.
Yes.
We would probably refer to that as wisdom, but that wisdom was meant something far more specific to that Hebrew mind, and it was that connection of ruling, but with riddling with the world, with poetry, with with Solomon, it's he can tell you a million facts about trees and plants, but then he can say to you, you know what you need to do? You need to go look at the ant. Because if you would watch the ant for a little bit, you would understand what you ought to be like.
Right.
Like that's mashal, and that's what a ruler is.
Yes.
So when we're passing on to our children this education, we're enculturating them in who they are, what their loves ought to be. I say enculturating, like what I'm saying is we're teaching them, the music that they should love, the stories that they should love. When you sit and you tell your children stories, when you read them St. George and the Dragon, but also when you tell them stories about pranks that you pulled in high school, you're raising them up to like, okay, I want to be like that. I want to be more like that. When you the food that you put on the table, the art that you put on the walls, you're telling them what is beautiful, what they should look for, what they should be like. When you're coaching them through how to handle the difficulties in their friendships, or like with our kids, one of the big things was learning how to suck it up. Learning how when you're crying to stop crying and to be able to pull it together. And I can control myself. You're teaching them what is virtuous, what is honorable, what is that they're aiming for. All of those things come together to be this enculturation. And I think when when it comes to schools, I believe schools should be an extension of the authority of mom and dad. And so when you send your kid to a school, or when you decide to homeschool and you pick your curriculum, what you're doing is you're hiring an institution to help you to continue to establish this enculturation that you're trying to pass on to your children. And this is why I love an educational institution, because I have certain things that I want to pass on to my kids, but it's beyond my capacity to pass that. So I'm hiring the greatest literature teacher I can find, the greatest music teacher I can find. I'm the worst one to pass on music to my children.
You don't want to give us a note here to demonstrate, Ben?
I'm the least musical person in my family by such a long shot. But it is really fun how, because my children received the education that they received, we have a piano in our house, there's a guitar, and it's just fun watching my kids just wander in, sit down at the piano, play something lovely, and then go on, do their homework somewhere. There's always music, but it's the enculturation I want for them, but it's not something I could have given them.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, that's excellent. Now, I'm just curious to know, it's an interesting question, this. That concept of Padeia and mashal, do you think there is a masculine expression of that and a feminine expression of that? What could that look like? One of the ways I could ask this question, Ben, is what do you make of the emphasis in some quarters of having boys-only schools and girls-only schools in developing these sort of cultural leaders?
So, I go back and forth on that, because I would say at first, on the one hand, I do think pulling the boys and the girls apart and letting the boys truly be boys and letting the girls be discipled in a uniquely feminine way, there's something deeply healthy about that. When boys are by themselves, the rowdiness, the the cockiness, the competitive, whatever.
Yes.
It's deeply off-putting, I think, many times to the female mind, and it's seen as problematic and something that needs to be disciplined.
Yes.
It's somehow that's disrespectful, that's not manly, and it's actually something that guys need to go somewhere and express.
Right.
I mean, all through elementary and early, well, at least all through elementary, I could just remember every day, recess, we go out and we just pummel each other, and then we just did that, and that's just all you did. And and if you didn't do that, there's something wrong and missing, you know? And that was just really important to do. That said, I am cynical about the total separation.
Right.
It's right there kind of at the very beginning of Scripture. It's not good for man to be alone. There is something that I think is helpful and completing to young men to be around young girls, and for young girls to be around young boys. I'm cynical about the total and complete separation. But at the same time, I think that it's wonderful to have your Boy Scouts or your boys at lunch, your boys only football team.
Right.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I want to talk a little bit about the infantilization of specifically young men, but I think this can extend to young women as well in contemporary education. When you think of things like youth groups, fraternity houses, and just generally many educational systems, they seem to extend adolescence far beyond its natural boundaries, delaying true maturity. How do you think this infantilization of young people has impacted Christian families and the broader culture?
Yeah.
And how should Christian education counteract this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, we refer to this the failure to launch syndrome.
Right. Yes.
These students who graduate from college and then can't go on and do anything with it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that goes back to how we conduct our college life. NSA, we don't do dorms. And I think that's become something that's a really important part of our identity. When a student shows up here, we say, hey, welcome to Moscow. Find yourself a house. Right. Figure out how to cook, figure out how to wash your clothes, figure it all out. Yeah. And what that does is that there's a steep on-ramp to adulting that they go up, and it means by the time they graduate, their ability to understand, I need to go get a job, I need to go get an apartment, it's time for me to get married. Also, I need to make sure I'm worshiping in a local church. Yeah. That's all totally normal for our graduates because it's what's been expected of them during their time here. Right. I think that college increasingly has removed those things by putting them in a dorm, funding it with imaginary money, Pell Grants and federal student loans, and then you never leave campus, and you're being infantilized. Now, I would say, I think there was a time in which that setup could have worked. First of all, when the money was not as easy, it's just too easy now. When the money was not as easy, you had to work for it more. And when the coursework at the school is much harder, then the fact that you eat in a cafeteria is, I don't think, as much of a problem because you're going through this intense period of testing. Right. But as the coursework has gone to where it's actually really, really easy, then your time here it's a few hours a day in college work, and the rest is in going to football games, going to the gym, the rec center. It's all entertainment, but it's not actual education. And so I think that having that saying you need to go through this for 4 years and having that be our pathway to adulthood, we have across our nation infantilized a whole generation and then said, now welcome to the workforce. Wow. You're a man, you're a woman, you know how to take care of yourself now. No, you don't. You've spent 4 years removing that skill and knowledge from them. Right.
Yeah, that's very well said. I want to move on here a little bit and sort of contrast the Christian liberal arts from a lot of the vocational training that we see in educational institutions today. How would you define what the Christian liberal arts are? And how does that discipline distinguish itself from vocational training?
Yeah. So the liberal arts that are, excuse me, the liberal arts are, there's a long tradition in the West of handing these down, and you see that the medieval university in as early as the 13th century starting to pop up all across Europe, and you have these certain subjects that emerge. I mean, ultimately, they're wanting to grow into a culmination of theological education because theology is the queen of sciences. But they start to distill what are the pieces that help form a mind to be able to think and communicate clearly. And so you've got rhetoric with logic and these sort of critical thinking skills that are packed into logic and reasoning. You have music, and it's interesting how much of the medieval education between music and frequently astronomy would come in, but they're all sort of mathematical arts. And it was this idea of like, can you see the system of the world and how music and the planets and all of these things kind of cohere. But it was a what we would now call a natural philosophy, basically an understanding of nature and how it all works and how it holds together. History, literature, philosophy, all of those were traditionally packed in there. And then it all comes together into theology, the queen of sciences, as well as, I should put at the beginning, a significant language study. There was an expectation that you would be gifted with language. That is kind of that the general sense of the liberal arts. But the thing that I would that you were building to is, how does that different from the vocational skills? The idea is you're creating a complete person who understands the world and themselves, and especially God, who He is in their relationship to Him. They understand that. Now, you would take that education and you could throw on a medical degree on top, or a law degree on top, or even a theological education going on to ministry on top. You could throw that on top, but this liberal arts education was seen as this is the complete package to be a completed person who's ready to go out and tackle whatever. Now you would go there, from there you would go into a career in business or politics or something like that. But you didn't need further vocational training for most of those things. You just needed to be a sharp person who's intelligent and ready to go. And this liberal arts education is what determined that you were that kind of person.
Creates these lifelong learners, people who have the capacity to grasp concepts and apply them.
Yeah, and I think that lifelong learning is more and more important in the I will push away from the vocational certification, but I think that this actually is a better way to prepare for the vocational world that we encounter now because of the speed and rapidity with which the workforce is changing. I mean, jobs are changing all the time with automation and new inventions and whatnot. And if you think you need a college degree for each of those jobs, you're lost. What you need is to be someone who has learned how to learn and to adapt and to move quickly. That's what's important. And the other thing I would say is, with the advent of AI, this is really interesting because I've been thinking this for a bit. And at the last conference for our creditors, this suddenly started to become a theme that is coming out, which is if AI is going to take over all of these things, then automation will become, automation is going to get ever present. And so many of the skills that you thought you needed to go to get this certification for, or this college degree, AI is going to come and take over that. What it can't do is become a true human. A true human. And the thing is, if you pay attention to an AI paper or something like that, you can sense it. You know the difference between this and a true human. I know the difference between AI generated art versus a photo. There are certain qualities and whatnot. And to be truly human, will become something unique and that will differentiate between yourself and everybody else. And so I think that an education that helps you to become uniquely human, that helps you understand what a person is and what we can bring, will continue to differentiate you even more than it ever did before.
Yeah, that's very good. I love that. Kind of writing on the back of this, Ben, does it ever concern you that in Christian education circles, classical Christian education circles, there can be this temptation to like the pageantry and the aesthetic of it at the expense of it being a launching pad for culture building? Mm-hmm. Do you have any concerns around that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that is just a regular temptation. Yes. Because it goes back to that great Cotton Mather quote. Mm-hmm. So, early American colonists before America's a nation, Cotton Mather is this great preacher, and he's describing the history of America that he has seen. Mm-hmm. And this is sad that he can see this before even American independence, but he says that that faithfulness begat prosperity in America. Faithfulness begat prosperity. The Puritans show up, they're faithful, industrious, work their tails off, they settle the land, and this incredible prosperity comes into the American colonies, and it's the fruit of faithfulness.
Yes.
So he says, faithfulness begot prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother.
Right.
I see this again and again in classical schools. You'll have a mom and a dad who are like, I want something for my children, and they'll sacrifice everything to build this school. And this school, they labor like crazy, and their faithfulness begets prosperity. Right. And this school has all of the ornaments and whatnot of this really glorious, selective, rigorous academic institution.
Right.
And then that goes to everyone's heads, and they begin to congratulate themselves on their exclusivity and their all of that. It goes to their heads, and they lose their faith because they become more impressed by the fake Corinthian columns on the front of their building than they do with the faith in their children.
Yes,
and that's just I think a sad thing.
Yes, and I think connected to that, Ben, something that I see as well is this temptation towards being likable and nice and thinking of that as the end goal of education as well. Mm-hmm. And many people then just, they're almost allergic to calluses, allergic to confrontation.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I've observed.
Yep.
Any comments on that?
Yeah. I think it's very difficult when you are trying to lead an institution to get into conflict. The bigger your institution, the more you want to steer clear of conflict because of the costliness of not doing well in the conflict.
Yes. And
so we steer clear of conflict. We pull back, and we do what is safe.
Right.
And that's how, an institution just slowly gets very compromised.
Right. I want to move on here a little bit and speak in relation to your position as president at NSA. Mm-hmm. NSA has made a principled decision to refuse federal funding. Mm-hmm. And I know that part of the reason there is to preserve the institution's missional integrity.
Yep.
I'm wondering what else goes into preserving the missional integrity of an institution like NSA. What kind of things do you think through to safeguard NSA veering away from its mission?
Yeah. In addition to the saying no to federal money.
Right.
I think one thing is just constantly asking that question. I think that's something that the board at NSA is really good at. The board the board at NSA, we have 13 members, 7 are permanent and 6 are on a rotation of terms. And the 7 permanent, one of the sort of burdens on them is that your job is to hold us to our mission. And we want to keep you, their job is to make sure that we stay on this mission. You know, the 6-term guys obviously want to keep us on our mission, but they can rotate through and help us network in businesses and schools. But the permanent members, it's really about making sure that we stay on their mission. And I feel this intensely every time I go into a board meeting. That is such a strong concern of theirs. And it's good because it keeps it in front of my eyes.
Yes.
One of the other places where I would see it would be in the hiring of faculty. I think it's really important that you get guys who get your mission and vision and are all in on it. You really want to hold steady in that direction. Another thing would be just with regard to, you mentioned the federal money, but that's not the only money that is out there. You know, a big part of my job is fundraising. And it's very easy for a large gift to get you off, off your mission.
Yes.
I noticed this with when we start looking at applying for grants. When you sit down, you'll find grant-making institutions. We have money for this. We have money for this. And what the temptation is always to sit down and say, so they're interested in this. If we started this program, we could get this $200,000 check from them. Or if we rebranded this like this, then they would give us $80K over here. And then all of a sudden, what you start to see is you are parting out your institution in order to get money. And suddenly it's like you have programs to get money instead of programs aligned to a vision that people are coming in to fund.
Right.
And so I think that it's just really important that you keep your mission and vision at the front. And when donors come along, you say, here's where we're going. And if they say, I want to support that, then you welcome them in. But if they say, oh, that's interesting, but I'd really like to see this over here started, well, then I have to say, that's great. Maybe you'll find somebody who's doing that. That's not what we're doing. We're doing this. I think those decisions are really tricky, and you have to make sure that you're constantly catching that, this is what's at stake at this moment, and I need to make sure I stay true to the vision.
Yeah. To what degree do you think through the mistakes of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton? They started off as great institutions, Christian institutions, and yet they veered off from their mission. To what degree does it cross your mind to want to protect NSA's missional integrity, learning the lessons from institutions that had not done that before?
Well, one thing I think we have to just concede is that I hate to break it to you, but we're both finite and mortal. My ability to grip this institution from beyond the grave, I don't have very much of a strength there. And so there is a sense in which I think we have to just be open-handed. God's going to do with this what he's going to do. I want to be faithful. I don't want to steer it in the right direction. But there are certain things I can't hand off to it. I can't hand immortality to NSA. I look at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and part of me wants to say, well, I think they had a pretty impressive run. It's a pretty impressive run. It's sad where they are now, and it's possible that maybe they'll even get recovered and brought back.
The heritage and the foundations are deep.
Exactly. I look at Oxford, and it's my college. John Owen was I believe, one of the major ministers at Christ Church. He was dean of Christ Church. But both of the Wesleys, were there, and you could go on and on. But then some really terrible stuff happened there. And Oxford in general, I don't know if you know the saying, Cambridge grew him, Oxford slew him. All these reformers that started at Cambridge got executed at Oxford. So I would say I want to do the best with what we've got, and I want to see it have his legacy as long as we can go. But I'm not under the delusion that I can make I can make decisions now that can guarantee NSA's eternal faithfulness.
Right. Yeah.
I do think we can work hard now to make sure that we throw as hard of a punch as we possibly can and set that loose in the world.
Yes.
And then God will do with it what he's going to do with it.
Exactly. One of the things that I love about NSA, love about your approach to leadership is you don't idolize playing it safe or simply keeping the institution surviving and going for the sake of it surviving and going. The focus really is the mission.
Yeah.
And what kind of thinking goes behind trying to spread that sort of courageous approach to everyone within the institution?
Yeah.
To not curtail to the temptation to bow to the idol of safety and survival.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Like, how do you pass that on? I mean, I think part of it is like I try to lead the school in such a way that if you came here, it's because you were attracted to that kind of thing.
Right.
Trying to provide opportunities of conflict and testing. You know, we have our intramural athletics where the guys are playing rugby. We're working on the pentathlon track meet for this spring, which is
nice.
If I get this right, is what I'm told. I think it's running a 200 something else, and then I think it's shot put, javelin, and then whoever's the top scores at that point, the two highest have to wrestle.
Good.
That's
iconic.
Exactly. Yeah, and at that point of like testing is good, conflict is good. I think the fact that we have oral finals at NSA, we're in finals week right now as we film this, and students have to go in one-on-one to face their instructor, and be examined and have all their weaknesses exposed. And it can be a very difficult, trying time, but it's formative. So putting that kind of conflict in the school, productive conflict, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's really good. As we land this plane, Ben, I want to talk about post-millennialism here and the necessity of having a post-millennial vision that sees the knowledge of the glory of God covering the earth as the waters cover the sea, right? And I want to know how Christian education contributes to this vision of kingdom building and cultural renewal. Yeah. How important is it to have this big view of the sovereignty of God, the lordship of Jesus Christ, this optimism that we are victorious in Christ in realizing a vision like this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's utterly foundational. Covenantal blessings in Scripture are always described in generational terms. Your salvation is for you and for your children. This is for you, and when you obey, the blessing is for 1,000 generations. Curses go to 4 generations, and blessings go to 1,000 generations. I think the reason why curses only go to 4 generations is because after the 4th generation, they're all dead. Right. When you're living under cultural cursing, culture falls apart, and it's just eliminated. But when you're under the blessing of God, it passes from you to your children, from them to their children, and on. And, we have this phrase where we talk about standing on the shoulders of those who went before you. Yes. And the thing about that is when you stand on the shoulders that went before you, you're taller. Yeah. You see further. And when I receive from those that went before me all that they had to pass on to me, I stand taller. And when I take all of that and hand it to my son and he receives it, he stands even taller than me. Yeah. And that passing on, that is education. That is the enculturation that I'm describing. When you refuse all of that, when you say, I don't want everything that you built, I want to start over from scratch, I want to burn it all to the ground, you are a short person. You are a short man. And you will get shorter and shorter until you have nothing. I think education is at the center of this passing on and multiplying and growing of what God has given us. It's an incredible blessing. And it's really sad to to me to see people resenting the cultural inheritance that they've been given.
Yeah.
All of that work to try to get you to resent your cultural heritage, that's robbing you of something amazing, you know, that you ought to be receiving, and that you would be greatly enriched if you would receive it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is the covenantal duty of Christian parents to provide their children a Christian education that heavily leans into that rich heritage. And I'd love to see a recovery of that.
Absolutely.
Well, Ben, let's find an excuse to do this again.
Okay.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was good.
All right.